August 30th, 1944, Maribor Railway Yard, Slovenia. Private Ralph Frederick Churches, Australian Infantry, number 3796, tightened the final bolt on a section of rail he'd just repaired for the German Reich. He'd been maintaining this railway line for 3 years, keeping locomotives running, fixing damaged track, ensuring military trains could transport troops and supplies through the crucial Drava Valley corridor into Austria. The Germans called him their best railway worker. What they didn't know was that Churches, nicknamed the Crow by fellow prisoners, had spent those 3 years building something else entirely. Not a tunnel through the ground, not forged papers in hidden workshops. He'd built trust, routine, and the perfect cover for the largest successful prisoner-of-war rescue operation in Europe during World War II. Working Camp 1046 GW operated as a sub-camp of Stalag Zntini in Maribor, German-occupied Slovenia. 105 Allied prisoners of war, British, Australian, New Zealander and French soldiers, maintained a vital stretch of railway between Maribor and Dravograd. The rail line connected German-occupied Slovenia directly into Austria, carrying Wehrmacht reinforcements, ammunition and supplies. Every train that passed along this line supported German military operations. The prisoners maintained everything. They repaired rails damaged by Allied bombing raids. They maintained switches and signals that controlled train movements. They serviced locomotives, cleaning boilers, adjusting valves, replacing worn components. They cleared debris from tracks after air attacks. The work was hard, physical, technical, and absolutely essential to German military infrastructure. The Germans considered this arrangement ideal from their perspective. Skilled prisoner labour maintained critical transportation infrastructure without requiring scarce German manpower. The prisoners couldn't escape. They were 25 kilometres from any territory not firmly under German control, surrounded by Wehrmacht units, working under armed guard every moment, and the surrounding countryside was actively patrolled by German military police and local collaborators. Every evening the prisoners returned to their barracks in the Maribor railway yard. Every morning they boarded the work train that transported them to repair sites along the line. The routine was predictable, comfortable for guards, and seemingly escape-proof. But the Germans had made a fundamental miscalculation that would cost them dearly. They'd put prisoners who understood engineering, logistics, and systematic planning in direct contact with the transportation infrastructure that could potentially facilitate their own escape. More critically, they'd established a predictable routine that repeated day after day, week after week, month after month. Guards followed the same procedures. Work trains departed at the same times. Prisoners worked in the same general locations. The same guards supervised the same work crews. Routine creates familiarity. Familiarity breeds complacency. Complacency creates vulnerability. Ralph Frederick. Churches understood this better than the Germans ever would. Born in South Australia, hence his nickname Crow, after the state's colloquial term crow eater for South Australians, Churches had been serving with the 248th Battalion when he was captured. He'd been on temporary duty with Headquarters Anzac Corps during the Allied evacuation from Greece in April-May 1941, when German forces overran their positions. 3 years in captivity had taught him patience, careful observation, and the immense value of appearing cooperative while planning something entirely different. He'd watched other escape attempts fail. Tunnels discovered, forged papers confiscated, prisoners shot, attempting to cross into liberated territory. He'd learned from every failure. The Germans had appointed Churches as the man of confidence, the Vertrauensmann in German military terminology, a liaison between prisoners and camp authorities. The position existed in most POW camps as a practical necessity. Camp commandants needed someone who could communicate effectively with prisoners, who could pass along German orders and regulations, who could organize work details and maintain discipline. The role required German language skills, diplomatic ability, technical competence, and, most importantly, the Germans' trust. Ralph Churches had all four qualities. As man of confidence, Churches negotiated work schedules with German overseers. He passed complaints from prisoners to camp commandants, requests for better food, medical attention for injured workers, replacement of worn-out tools. He met with Red Cross inspectors when they visited the camp, providing information about prisoner conditions and welfare. He coordinated work assignments, deciding which prisoners would work on which sections of track on any given day. The Germans believed Churches was keeping prisoners in line, maintaining order, preventing escape attempts, ensuring productive labour. They trusted him completely. Churches was doing the opposite. His position gave him freedom of movement that other prisoners completely lacked. He could approach guards to discuss work assignments without arousing suspicion. He could observe German operations under the legitimate guise of coordinating prisoner labour. He had authorised reasons to know train schedules, guard rotation patterns, security procedures, and camp routines. Most importantly, he could communicate with people outside the camp through channels the Germans considered routine and unthreatening. Driver Leslie Arthur Laws, British Army, 127th Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, Royal Engineers, served as the work camp's official translator. His fluent German made him absolutely indispensable to camp operations. Guards who couldn't communicate clearly with English-speaking prisoners relied on Laws to convey orders and receive responses. German overseers used Laws to explain technical requirements for railway maintenance work. Camp administrators needed Laws to translate written documents, regulations, and Red Cross correspondence. His linguistic skills gave him access to information other prisoners never heard. Laws could overhear guards discussing security matters when they thought no English speakers were present. He could read German orders and regulations posted for camp staff. He could interpret subtle changes in camp procedures that might indicate German awareness of escape planning. He understood the nuances of German military hierarchy and could predict which orders would be enforced strictly and which would be applied loosely. Together, Churches and Laws formed the core of what would eventually become a sophisticated escape organization. Their opportunity came through something as simple as water. Slovenian families living in small villages near the railway provided water and occasional food to prisoners working along the line. Small acts of quiet resistance against German occupation. These weren't organized resistance actions. They were individual families who saw Allied prisoners suffering under German supervision and chose to help in whatever modest ways they could. A farmer's wife might leave a bucket of water near a work site. A village family might pass bread to prisoners when guards weren't watching closely. These gestures created human connections across the divide of occupation and captivity. Through one of these Slovenian families, Laws made contact with an agent of the 2nd Slovenian Brigade, Yugoslav, the Slovenian Partisans. The partisan movement in Slovenia had been fighting German occupation since the first partisan shot was fired on July 22, 1941. By 1944, 3 years into their resistance campaign, they controlled significant territory in mountain regions, particularly in the densely forested Pohorje range north of Maribor. They'd established communication networks with British intelligence services. They'd built temporary airfields in temporarily liberated zones where Allied aircraft could land to deliver supplies and evacuate wounded fighters. They'd conducted hundreds of operations against German forces, ambushes, sabotage, intelligence gathering, rescuing downed Allied aircrews. but they'd never attempted anything on the scale of what Ralph Churches was about to propose. Major Franklin Lindsay, Office of Strategic Services, commanded a joint British-American liaison mission, codenamed Cuckold, operating with the Slovenian partisans' 4th Operational Zone. Lindsay's mission combined several responsibilities. He coordinated Allied air support for partisan operations. He facilitated supply drops of weapons, ammunition, and medical equipment. He gathered intelligence about German military movements for transmission to Allied headquarters. And critically for this story, he assisted escapers and evaders, Allied personnel who'd escaped from captivity or evaded capture behind German lines. On June 24, 1944, 2 escaped POWs reached Lindsay's position in the Pohorje Mountains. Private Owen Peterson and driver Alfred Ashley had broken out of a work detail weeks earlier and managed to contact partisan fighters who'd guided them to safety. They brought Major Lindsay detailed information about Working Camp 1046 or GW. The camp was located directly in the Maribor railway yard, surrounded by tracks, locomotives and warehouses. Allied bombing raids targeting the rail yard put prisoners at extreme risk. Bombs intended for German infrastructure frequently landed near prisoner barracks. The camp held over 100 Allied soldiers, all of them skilled workers the Germans were exploiting for critical infrastructure maintenance. Most importantly, the prisoners worked outside the wire every single day. Lindsay immediately recognized an opportunity, not merely to rescue prisoners from dangerous conditions, but to remove 100 trained soldiers from forced labor, directly supporting German military logistics while simultaneously demonstrating partisan capability to conduct complex operations deep in German-controlled territory. The strategic implications were significant. Every day these prisoners maintained railways. German trains moved supplies to front lines. Every locomotive they repaired carried Wehrmacht troops toward combat. Every section of track they fixed enabled German logistics to function smoothly. Removing these prisoners meant disrupting German infrastructure maintenance. Rescuing them meant German authorities would need to divert actual German workers or soldiers to perform railway maintenance. The operation would have effects far beyond simply freeing 100 men. Lindsay radioed MI9, the British intelligence section responsible for escape and evasion operations, informing them he planned to launch a rescue attempt. He requested authorization, logistical support, and coordination with Allied air forces for eventual evacuation. MI9 approved the operation. Churches and Laws had been developing their escape plan independently for months. In early 1944, after years of observation and careful thinking, they'd agreed to cooperate on an escape attempt. Their initial concept was necessarily modest. Perhaps 7 or 8 men could slip away from a work detail, the absolute maximum number who could feasibly hide from guards during the confusion of a workday. Contact with the partisans through the Slovenian families expanded their thinking dramatically. If partisans could provide armed support for a rescue operation, they could potentially liberate dozens of prisoners, maybe 50, maybe all of them. The planning required extraordinary precision and patience. Churches needed to select men for the initial escape who met multiple demanding criteria. They had to be absolutely trustworthy. One informer would destroy everything. They had to be physically capable of moving quickly through rough mountain terrain after years of captivity. They had to be mentally prepared for the extreme risks involved. They had to be able to articulate the camp's layout, security procedures, work routines, and guard patterns to partisan commanders who would plan the larger rescue. Most importantly, they had to be willing to take enormous personal risk, not just for their own escape, but to potentially facilitate freedom for every prisoner in the camp. Churches chose carefully over weeks of quiet observation. 3 British soldiers known for steadiness under pressure, 2 Australians who'd maintained physical fitness despite captivity, 2 New Zealanders with strong endurance, 7 men total from their 8-man barrack who shared work duties and could coordinate without attracting German attention. The 8th man from their barrack couldn't be included. His work assignment on a different section of track would make it impossible for him to slip away without immediate discovery. His absence would trigger instant alarm. The plan required that guards not realize anyone was missing until the work train returned to camp at day's end. On August 30th, 1944, the 7 selected prisoners executed their escape with remarkable coordination. Throughout the morning work shift, they moved away from their work crew under various plausible pretexts that wouldn't trigger immediate suspicion. One prisoner told his guard he needed to retrieve specialized tools from a storage shed 50 meters away. Another reported a potential problem with rail alignment requiring immediate inspection before trains could safely pass. A third claimed sudden illness necessitating an urgent latrine break, a request guards rarely refused, since denying it could result in humiliating accidents. A fourth was sent by a guard to fetch water for the work crew. Separately, casually, without any coordination visible to watching guards, 7 men drifted away from German supervision over the course of 3 hours. The partisan agent who'd maintained contact through Slovenian families met them at a predetermined location. A small ravine concealed by dense forest, invisible from the worksite. He led them rapidly up into the mountains surrounding the work area. Moving through terrain, the Germans couldn't patrol effectively without significant military force. By evening, when the work train returned to camp and guards conducted the mandatory prisoner count, 7 men were missing. German security responded exactly as Churches had predicted. Guards conducted an immediate search of the worksite and the immediately surrounding area. They found nothing. The missing prisoners had vanished into the densely forested Pohorje Mountains, guided by people who knew every trail, every hiding place, every route through terrain the Germans barely understood. Churches and his group reached the village of Lovrenk na Pohorju by nightfall, approximately 12 kilometers from where they'd started, moving constantly uphill through difficult terrain. The village was temporarily in partisan control, part of a liberated zone the Germans hadn't yet committed forces to retake. The commander of the 2nd Slovenian Brigade met them personally, curious about Allied prisoners appearing in his operational area. What happened next defined Ralph Church's leadership, strategic vision, and remarkable courage. Rather than continuing their own escape to safety, they were already free, already beyond German reach, already positioned to be evacuated to Allied lines. Churches convinced the brigade commander to conduct an immediate military operation to liberate the remaining prisoners. The proposal was audacious: attack a German work detail deep in enemy-controlled territory, overwhelm armed guards, free 90-plus additional prisoners, then guide more than 100 men through 250 kilometers of contested territory while evading what would certainly be a massive German manhunt. Churches provided detailed intelligence that made the operation feasible. He explained the exact layout of the worksite. He described guard strength, typically 5 to 7 soldiers supervising each work detail. He outlined work schedules. The train departed camp at 0600 hours, arrived at work sites by 0700 hours, prisoners disembarked and collected tools. He identified security procedures. Guards positioned themselves at specific locations, followed predictable patterns, became relaxed once work began. He explained that approximately 90 prisoners remained in the camp, all of whom would board the work train the next morning. He knew the exact route the train would take, through a railway cutting in a remote area perfect for ambush. He knew where guards would be positioned when prisoners disembarked. He knew the critical timing window when guards would be least prepared for sudden attack. The brigade commander recognized the tactical opportunity immediately. The railway cutting provided natural cover for approaching forces. Guards would be minimal. German authorities considered the work detail low risk because of the isolated location and the belief that prisoners had nowhere to flee even if they escaped supervision. A quick raid by 20 armed partisans could overwhelm 5 to 7 guards before they could radio for reinforcement. The partisans could hit the train, free the prisoners, and withdraw into the mountains before German reaction forces could respond. Planning proceeded through the night of August 30-31. Churches drew diagrams showing the work site layout. Laws translated everything into precise German military terminology, so partisan commanders understood exactly what German security procedures they'd be disrupting. Partisan scouts confirmed that German patrols hadn't been increased despite the previous day's escape. A critical piece of intelligence suggesting the Germans believed the 7 missing prisoners were attempting to flee south toward partisan territory, not planning to return. At 0200 hours on August 31st, 2 o'clock in the morning, Churches and Laws, accompanied by 20 heavily armed partisans, moved back through German lines. This required extraordinary boldness. They were moving from safely liberated territory back into German-controlled areas. If discovered, everyone would be shot immediately. Escaping prisoners don't get second chances, and partisans captured behind German lines face execution under Wehrmacht anti-partisan protocols. They positioned themselves in the railway cutting where the work train would pass later that morning. The night was dark, moonless, with heavy cloud cover. Perfect conditions for movement, but terrible for maintaining unit cohesion. German patrols hadn't detected their infiltration. Everything now depended on timing, surprise, and the prisoners' ability to respond quickly when liberation came. The work train arrived precisely on schedule at 06:45 hours. German military efficiency manifested in predictable railway operations. Prisoners disembarked from cattle cars that served as their transport. They began collecting their tools for the day's maintenance work: shovels, picks, rail tongs, hammers, wrenches. Guards took their standard positions. 4 guards forming a loose perimeter around the work site, 1 guard remaining with the train engineer, 2 guards smoking cigarettes and talking casually near the locomotive. The guards were relaxed, routine, conducting another ordinary day managing prisoner labour. Then 20 partisans exploded from concealment in the railway cutting, howling Slovenian battle cries. The sound shattered the morning stillness. Guards froze for critical seconds, unable to process what was happening. Partisans were attacking a prisoner work detail, this deep in German-controlled territory. What kind of insane tactical decision was this? By the time German soldiers' brains processed the situation and their hands reached for weapons, partisans had them surrounded. 20 rifles pointed at 7 guards from multiple directions. Escape was impossible. Fighting was suicide. Not a single shot was fired. Every guard surrendered immediately, hands raised, weapons dropped. Churches stepped forward from the group of partisans and addressed the stunned prisoners in English. His voice was calm, authoritative, carrying the confidence of a man who'd planned this moment for months. He explained the situation in clear, simple terms. The partisans had come to liberate them. They would march back over the mountains to partisan-controlled territory. From there, they'd be guided to an airfield in liberated zones. Allied aircraft would fly them to safety in Italy. They were going home. Not every prisoner responded with immediate enthusiasm or gratitude. 3 years in captivity creates a particular psychology that civilians rarely understand. Extreme caution becomes instinctive. Fear of failure dominates decision-making. Hope itself becomes dangerous. Hoping for something and having it destroyed hurts worse than never hoping at all. Routine, even the routine of captivity, feels safer than uncertainty. Some prisoners argued they should wait for Allied liberation. The Russian army was advancing from the east. Everyone knew this from BBC broadcasts. Guards sometimes left playing where prisoners could hear. British and American forces were pushing through Italy. Surely they'd reach Austria soon. Why risk death in the mountains when liberation might come peacefully in weeks or months? Why trust partisans they'd never met? What if this was a German trick to identify potential escapers? Churches didn't waste time with gentle persuasion or patient argument. He was blunt, harsh, direct, speaking with the authority of the man of confidence, but now using that authority to command rather than negotiate. They were being given a chance at freedom right now. They could take it or remain prisoners. But he and Laws were leaving with the partisans immediately, whether others followed or not. This was the only offer. There would be no second chance. German reaction would be swift and brutal once the raid was discovered. Anyone who stayed would face interrogation, potential punishment for the escape of others, and, quite possibly, execution as an example. The harshness worked where gentleness might have failed. Church's absolute certainty, his refusal to accommodate doubt or fear, forced other prisoners to make a binary choice: freedom or captivity, movement or paralysis, trust or continued submission. Every single prisoner chose freedom. 98 men liberated in the raid, 7 who'd escaped the previous day, 10 French prisoners who'd been working at a neighbouring farm and were swept up in the partisan operation. 115 Allied soldiers now depended on Slovenian fighters to guide them through 250 kilometres of mountainous territory contested between partisan forces and German occupation troops. The march began immediately. No time for rest, food, or adjustment to sudden freedom. German reaction would be massive once the work train failed to return. Every minute of delay increased danger. The partisans had to move 115 men who weren't trained in guerrilla movement, who weren't accustomed to the physical demands of mountain terrain, who'd spent years in captivity with inadequate nutrition and limited physical conditioning. The partisan commander organized strict movement protocols designed to maximize stealth and minimize the group's visibility. Single file at all times. No walking side by side, no clustering in groups. 15 pace intervals between each man. If the column was spotted from the air, spacing would make it harder to judge numbers. Movement, primarily at night when German patrols were less active and aircraft couldn't operate. Minimal stops for rest. Never more than 4 hours in any 24-hour period. No fires, no smoking, no loud conversations. Absolute discipline. The German response exceeded even Church's pessimistic predictions. When the work train failed to return to camp on schedule, German security protocols activated immediately. Camp authorities conducted emergency counts of all remaining prisoners. German military police were notified of a mass escape. Wehrmacht intelligence coordinated with Gestapo officers responsible for tracking resistance activities. By mid-afternoon, August 31st, German commanders had confirmed through interrogation of remaining prisoners that partisans had raided the work detail. The scale of response revealed how seriously German authorities viewed the situation. 50,000 personnel, 50,000 soldiers, military police, Gestapo agents, local police, and Hitler Youth units were mobilized to search for the escaped prisoners and punish the partisans who'd facilitated the escape. 50,000. For 115 escaped POWs. The number seems absurd until you understand the strategic calculation. German authorities couldn't allow this precedent. If partisans could successfully raid a work detail and liberate all prisoners, that demonstrated weakness in German security. It encouraged other partisan operations. It inspired prisoners in other camps to believe escape was possible. It suggested German control of occupied territory was far weaker than propaganda claimed. Most dangerously from the German perspective, it freed 100 men who'd been maintaining critical military infrastructure. Those men would need to be replaced. German civilians or soldiers would have to perform railway maintenance. Resources would be diverted. Logistics would be disrupted. The 50,000 personnel committed to search operations represented an enormous opportunity cost for Germany. Those troops couldn't be used defending front lines. Those police couldn't be deployed against other resistance activities. Those resources were locked into searching mountains for prisoners. Even if every single escaped prisoner had been recaptured within hours, the operation would still have succeeded strategically by forcing Germany to commit such massive resources. The column moved continuously through the first 4 days, pausing only for brief meals and absolutely minimal rest. Partisan guides led them through mountain ridges where visibility was limited, heavily wooded slopes where tree cover prevented aerial observation, and isolated trails far from German patrolled roads. They passed through small villages where partisan supporters provided food and water. They avoided any location where German forces might be present. The physical demands were extreme. Prisoners who'd spent 3 years performing railway maintenance labor were stronger than most POWs, but mountain trekking requires different conditioning. The terrain was steep, rocky, and relentlessly difficult. Some men developed severe blisters within the first day. Others suffered from inadequate footwear. Their prisoner boots were designed for flat railway work, not climbing mountains. The partisans set a punishing pace because speed meant survival. 4 days into the march, disaster struck with sudden violence. The column was crossing a ridge at midnight on September 3rd, still maintaining single file with 15-pace intervals, when German forces hidden in the darkness opened fire without warning. Machine gun and rifle fire raked the ridge from multiple positions. The leading partisan was killed instantly, cut down by the initial burst of fire. Everyone else scattered in pure survival instinct, breaking formation, seeking any available cover in the darkness. Men dove behind rocks, pressed themselves flat against the ground, crawled into depressions in the terrain. The firefight lasted only minutes but felt like hours. Partisans returned fire to cover the prisoners' escape. The column fragmented in the chaos and darkness. 6 prisoners went missing, separated from the main group, possibly captured, possibly killed, possibly simply lost in unfamiliar terrain. The group regrouped approximately 1 mile back from the German position, conducting whispered roll calls to determine who was present. One of their 2 armed partisan escorts was confirmed dead. 6 POWs were unaccounted for. The guide who remained took command without hesitation. He couldn't spare time to search for missing men. The German ambush proved enemy forces knew approximately where the column was moving. Delay meant capture or death for everyone. The column had to move immediately, find an alternate route, and put distance between themselves and the German position. The guide led them silently around the German ambush site, moving through terrain so close they could hear enemy soldiers talking in undertones. Germans were coordinating their positions, reporting the contact by radio, setting up to intercept any further movement along the ridge. The column passed within 50 yards of German soldiers, so close that any sound would mean discovery, so close they could smell cigarette smoke from German positions. Every man controlled his breathing, stepped with extraordinary care, prayed silently that no one would stumble, cough, or make any noise that would betray their presence. They got through. Pure luck, perfect discipline, and the darkness that concealed them. One of the 6 prisoners separated during the ambush, Private Kenneth Carson, displayed remarkable individual resilience. He'd become disoriented in the darkness and chaos, separated from the main column, alone in enemy-controlled territory, with no map, no food, and no clear direction towards safety. But Carson knew the general direction the column had been moving. He knew partisan territory was somewhere to the south and west. He knew his survival depended on avoiding German patrols while somehow making contact with friendly forces. For 2 days he moved alone through hostile territory, travelling at night, hiding during daylight, drinking from streams, eating nothing. On his 3rd day of solitary movement, exhausted and nearly at the end of his physical reserves, he encountered a partisan patrol. They were initially suspicious. A lone Allied soldier moving through their territory could be a German plant or a desperate man who might lead enemies to partisan positions. But Carson's uniform, his Australian accent, and his detailed knowledge of the escape convinced them he was genuine. They escorted him back to the main column. He'd covered approximately 30 kilometers on his own, navigating by instinct and determination. The other 5 prisoners separated during the ambush were never recovered. Their ultimate fate remained unknown. They may have been captured and returned to German custody. They may have been killed during the firefight or in subsequent encounters with German forces. They may have attempted to reach safety independently and failed. Records provide no answers. 5 men vanished into the chaos of war. By September 5th, 8 days after the escape began, the column reached the liberated area in the Savinja River Valley. They'd trekked approximately 160 kilometers through constantly hostile territory, evading search operations involving 50,000 German personnel. The partisans provided them with their longest rest period since the escape began, a half-day stop in a secure location. Men collapsed from exhaustion, slept deeply for the first time in over a week, ate proper meals prepared by partisan support staff. Major Franklin Lindsay met them in the valley. He'd been coordinating with MI9 throughout the escape, arranging evacuation flights, securing authorization for Allied aircraft to land at partisan airfields. Seeing 100 men arrive after such an incredible journey, dirty, exhausted, many injured but alive and free, vindicated his decision to support the operation. The column still faced significant challenges. They had to cross the Sava River, a major watercourse nearly 500 yards wide at the designated crossing point. The river was too deep to wade. Men would drown attempting to cross. It was too wide and too swift to swim, particularly for men weakened by years of captivity and 8 days of forced marching with minimal food. German forces controlled both banks at many locations along the river. Patrols watched for exactly this kind of escape activity. The partisans had worked out an elegant solution that exploited German pragmatism. Local farmers needed to cross the river regularly during harvest season to collect grain from fields on the opposite bank. Food production had to continue even in contested territory. Both Germans and partisans needed agricultural output to feed their forces and civilian populations. Germans had authorized horse-drawn cart crossings at specific points where they maintained guard posts. Guards checked farmers' documents, but generally waved agricultural traffic through quickly because they understood the economic necessity. Partisan organizers arranged with cooperative farmers to accidentally have empty carts available when escaped prisoners needed transportation. The prisoners were divided into small groups of 5 to 8 men. Each group hid in a farmer's cart beneath loads of harvested grain, hay, or agricultural equipment. Guards at river crossing points conducted cursory inspections, lifting one corner of a tarp, glancing at the load, checking the farmer's documents, and waved them through. Just another farmer bringing in his harvest. Nothing suspicious. The guards had no idea they were facilitating the largest POW escape in European history. Once across the Sava, prisoners emerged from hiding and continued the trek on foot, but progress north of the river proved even more difficult than the journey south. German patrols were intensely active in this region. Wehrmacht intelligence had analyzed the escape's likely trajectory and concluded the prisoners would need to cross the Sava. German forces concentrated search operations on both banks of the river and in the territory beyond. Partisan guides moved the column extremely slowly and cautiously, using every bit of available concealment. The September 3rd ambush had taught everyone that one moment of carelessness meant casualties. On September 7th, after 10 days of continuous movement, the column was handed to the care of the Kamnik Zasavje detachment, partisan forces responsible for escorting escapers through the final leg of the journey. These fighters specialized in moving people and supplies through German-controlled territory. They knew every trail, every safe house, every place where German patrols operated. The journey from Ojbolt to the partisan airfield at Semic in Bela Krajina covered 273 kilometers, 14 days of continuous movement, 273 kilometers on foot through mountains, forests, river valleys, and enemy-controlled territory. The prisoners were beyond exhausted. Many suffered from severe blisters that had become infected. Several had twisted ankles or knee injuries from the demanding terrain. Everyone bore the accumulated physical and psychological stress of evading 50,000 searchers for 2 weeks. But they were alive, they were free, and Allied aircraft were waiting. The airfield at Semic wasn't what anyone from a Western nation would recognize as an airport. It was a cleared field in partisan-controlled territory, rough and minimally maintained, with no paved runways, no control tower, no facilities beyond basic fuel storage. But Allied transport aircraft, primarily Douglas C-47 Dakotas, had been landing there for months, bringing supplies to partisans and evacuating wounded fighters to Allied medical facilities in Italy. The pilots who flew these missions were specialists in operating from improvised airfields in hostile territory. Now they would evacuate escaped POWs. The final count of successful escapees: 20 Frenchmen, 9 New Zealanders, 12 Australians, and 59 British soldiers. 100 men total who completed the full journey. 5 lost during the September 3rd ambush, captured, killed, or separated beyond recovery. 10 more than the original number at Ojbolt, because additional prisoners had been freed in supplementary partisan raids on work sites near the main operation. 100 Allied soldiers removed from forced labour supporting German military logistics. 50,000 Axis personnel diverted from frontline duties, garrison responsibilities, and anti-partisan operations to search for them unsuccessfully. The largest successful POW rescue operation in the European theatre during World War II. A demonstration that partisan forces could conduct sophisticated operations deep in German-controlled territory. A propaganda victory showing that Allied prisoners weren't abandoned behind enemy lines. The prisoners flew to Bari, Italy, in groups over several days. Allied authorities processed them through reception centres designed for returned POWs and escaped personnel. Medical examinations identified health issues requiring treatment: malnutrition, untreated injuries, infections, parasites. Intelligence debriefing sessions documented their captivity experience. Camp conditions, German security procedures, forced labour operations, potential intelligence about German military activities they'd observed. Arrangements for repatriation began immediately. Soldiers were eager to return to Britain, Australia, New Zealand, France, reunite with families, resume normal lives. Ralph Churches wrote a detailed account of the operation after Australian Army authorities relieved him of his security obligations. His book, titled 100 Miles as the Crow Flies, documented the entire operation from initial planning through final evacuation. He wrote about the 3 years of captivity that preceded the escape. He described the patient process of building trust with Germans while secretly planning liberation. He detailed the partisan operation, the 14-day march, the challenges and dangers. He honoured the Slovenian fighters who'd risked their lives to rescue Allied prisoners. The book was later translated into Slovenian as Vranov let v svobodo, Crow's Flight into Freedom. The Slovenian title captured the operation's essence perfectly: a direct flight path through impossible terrain, guided by individuals who knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. Post-war analysis revealed the operation's broader strategic impact beyond simply freeing 100 prisoners. The raid at Ojbolt removed 105 prisoners from Stalag 16D's forced labour system. German authorities responded by immediately tightening security on all railway work details administered by the Stalag. This required additional guards. It meant more frequent inspections. It necessitated more complex security procedures. All of this reduced the efficiency of prisoner labour across the entire camp administration. Railway maintenance schedules slipped because prisoners worked under closer supervision that slowed operations. Rail repairs took longer because Germans now trusted prisoners less. The very infrastructure prisoners had been forced to maintain became less reliable because paranoid German security hampered efficient work. More significantly, from Allied strategic perspective, the raid demonstrated that partisan forces possessed sophistication, coordination, and capability far beyond German estimates. 50,000 German personnel spent 2 weeks searching mountains, while partisans successfully moved a column of 100 POWs right through the search perimeter. Wehrmacht intelligence analysts wrote reports concluding that partisan capabilities and organization had been severely underestimated. This prompted reallocation of additional German forces to anti-partisan operations throughout Yugoslavia, forces that couldn't be used defending against advancing Russian armies or reinforcing crumbling positions in Italy. Every German soldier committed to fighting partisans was a soldier unavailable for frontline combat. The prisoner's psychological journey reveals dimensions that statistics and operational reports miss. 3 years in captivity creates mental patterns that don't disappear when gates open. Routine becomes comforting because it's predictable. Risk avoidance becomes deeply instinctive because taking risks in captivity usually means punishment. The known misery of imprisonment feels psychologically safer than unknown dangers of escape. Hope itself becomes dangerous. Hoping for freedom and having that hope crushed hurts worse than never allowing yourself to hope at all. Church's harshness after the partisan raid, his absolute refusal to accommodate prisoners' reluctance or fear, addressed this damaged psychology directly and necessarily. He didn't ask men to be brave. He didn't give inspirational speeches about freedom and patriotism. He told them they were leaving immediately and they could come or not. The choice wasn't about courage or ideology. It was about accepting an unexpected opportunity when it appeared. Many prisoners acknowledged years later that Church's bluntness was exactly what they needed. They'd spent so long being cautious, so many years suppressing hope and avoiding risk, that they'd forgotten how to seize chances when they appeared. They needed someone to make the decision for them, to eliminate debate, to force movement when paralysis felt safer. Churches did exactly that. His leadership wasn't gentle or democratic. It was decisive, commanding, and ultimately effective. The German guards captured during the raid faced brutal consequences from their own military hierarchy. Wehrmacht authorities launched investigations into how partisans had penetrated so deeply into German-controlled territory. Why had guards surrendered without firing a single shot? Why had no warning been transmitted by radio before capture? Why had basic security protocols failed? 3 guards were court-martialed for cowardice under enemy fire. The senior guard assigned to the work detail, an underofficer with 12 years of military service, committed suicide before his trial, unable to face the shame and certain punishment. German military police concluded the guards had been incompetent, inadequately trained, and insufficiently vigilant in their duties. This conclusion completely missed the operational reality of the situation. 20 armed, trained partisan fighters charging from concealment against 7 guards supervising a routine work detail. The tactical situation was utterly unwinnable for the guards. Fighting would have meant certain death within seconds. Surrendering was the only rational choice that offered any chance of survival. But Wehrmacht military culture in 1944, shaped by years of Nazi ideology emphasizing absolute commitment and fanatical resistance, couldn't accept rational surrender as legitimate. Guards were expected to fight to the death regardless of tactical circumstances, regardless of whether resistance served any military purpose. The fact that these guards chose survival over suicidal resistance was treated as criminal failure, deserving severe punishment. Prisoners who'd maintained the railway under guard for 3 years understood a profound and bitter irony. Every section of track they'd repaired had enabled German military trains to transport troops toward front lines, where those troops killed Allied soldiers. Every locomotive they'd serviced had pulled cars carrying ammunition that German artillery fired at Allied positions. Every signal they'd maintained had facilitated German logistics supporting Wehrmacht operations. Every day they'd worked, they'd supported the enemy's war effort. Refusing to work would have meant immediate punishment, beatings, reduced rations, solitary confinement, potentially execution for sabotage. Geneva Convention protections theoretically prohibited forcing prisoners to perform work directly supporting enemy military operations, but German authorities interpreted railway maintenance as general infrastructure work rather than direct military support. Prisoners had no practical choice. They worked because the alternative was death. But this forced collaboration created moral weight that pressed on every prisoner's conscience. They were keeping German trains running. They were helping the enemy. No matter that they had no choice, the work itself felt like betrayal. The escape redeemed 3 years of coerced labor in a single operation. By using their intimate knowledge of railway operations, schedules, routes, security procedures, guard patterns, to facilitate their own liberation, prisoners transformed forced collaboration into intelligence that enabled freedom. The trains they'd maintained had transported them to work sites where contact with partisans became possible. The routine they'd helped establish made guards complacent and predictable. The trust they'd built through competent work made Germans relax security protocols. The technical expertise they'd developed maintaining locomotives and track gave them credibility as essential workers, which reduced guard vigilance. Everything they'd been forced to do became tools they used for escape. Churches and laws understood this redemptive possibility from the very beginning of their planning. Their cooperation with German camp authorities, churches as man of confidence, laws as translator, wasn't collaboration in any moral sense. It was reconnaissance conducted under deep cover over 3 years. Every conversation with guards revealed information about security procedures. Every work assignment outside the camp wire created opportunities for contact with local populations. Every day they appeared to be model prisoners, reinforced German assumptions that these men were pacified, resigned to captivity, no longer thinking about resistance or escape. German authorities never suspected their best railway workers were planning the largest escape operation in European history. This blindness stemmed from fundamental misunderstanding of prisoner psychology and underestimation of human resilience. Germans assumed that 3 years in captivity would inevitably break fighting spirit. They assumed that daily routine would create psychological dependence on structure. They assumed that prisoners who cooperated with work requirements had accepted their situation and abandoned thoughts of escape. They assumed that competent labor indicated genuine cooperation rather than strategic positioning. Every single assumption was completely wrong. Fighting spirit doesn't disappear under captivity. It adapts, becomes more patient, more calculating, more strategic. Routine doesn't create dependence. It creates predictability that can be exploited. Cooperation can be a perfect mask for sophisticated planning. Competent labor earns trust that can be weaponized. The raid at Ojbolt succeeded because churches, laws, and the other prisoners understood what their captors never did, that every day spent working on German railways was simultaneously a day spent learning how to use those railways for escape. They didn't build a physical train like the title suggests. They built something far more valuable: systematic knowledge of German operations, relationships with local populations who could help them, trust with partisan networks, and detailed understanding of security procedures and vulnerabilities. They built a plan that used German transportation infrastructure against German military interests. The work train that carried them to repair sites every morning became the mechanism of their eventual liberation, not because they hijacked it or commandeered it, but because they understood it better than the Germans who controlled it. They knew the schedules, the routes, the procedures, the predictable patterns. They knew exactly where and when they'd be vulnerable. They used that knowledge to create the perfect opportunity for partisan intervention. Post-war commemoration of the operation recognized its historical significance. The Crow's flight trail now traverses 273 kilometers from Ojbolt to Otok near Metlika, retracing the exact route Churches and 100 men walked to freedom. Military personnel from Allied nations hike the trail annually, maintaining traditions of friendship forged in war. The International Research Center for the Second World War operates at the site of former Stalag 16D in Maribor, preserving history and honoring both prisoners and Slovenian partisans. Ralph Churches lived long enough to see his story recognized and honored. He returned to Slovenia multiple times after the war. He met partisan fighters who'd guided the escape, men and women who'd risked their lives for Allied soldiers they'd never met. He participated in commemorative events marking anniversaries of the operation. He spoke at schools about the importance of never accepting imprisonment as permanent, about the value of patience in planning, about trusting people who offer help even when circumstances make trust difficult. He died in 1996, knowing that his refusal to accept captivity, combined with 3 years of patient planning and extraordinary courage, had saved 100 lives, dealt a significant strategic blow to German military logistics, and demonstrated that resistance was possible even in seemingly hopeless circumstances. The raid at Ojbolt proved multiple profound truths about warfare, resistance, and human resilience. Prisoners who appear to cooperate with captors can simultaneously be planning sophisticated operations. Routine creates vulnerabilities that patient observers can exploit. Forced labor provides opportunities for those clever and determined enough to recognize them. Trust can be built strategically and used as a weapon. And sometimes the most effective escape isn't tunneling under fences or forging documents. It's understanding your captor's system so thoroughly that you can use that system against them. The Germans never expected prisoners maintaining their railways to build an escape plan using those same railways. They assumed control. They assumed compliance. They assumed 3 years of captivity had broken these men permanently. They made every assumption except the correct one, that intelligent, determined soldiers never stop being soldiers regardless of captivity, that every day in prison can be a day of reconnaissance if you maintain the right mindset, that patience and careful observation create opportunities that desperate immediate action never could. Churches and Laws, along with 103 other men, walked free because they'd spent 3 years building something invisible to their captors, not a physical tunnel through the ground, not forged identity papers, but perfect, systematic knowledge of German operations, carefully cultivated relationships with potential helpers, strategic positioning that appeared to be cooperation but was actually preparation, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. That moment came on August 30th, 1944, when 7 men slipped away from a work detail. 24 hours later, 105 prisoners were marching toward freedom guided by partisan fighters. 14 days after that, 100 men flew to safety in Allied-controlled Italy. German authorities mobilized 50,000 personnel to search for them. Not one was recaptured. The prisoners who'd maintained German railways for 3 years had built themselves a path to freedom using the very system they'd been forced to serve. The Germans never saw it coming because they'd made the fatal mistake of confusing visible cooperation with genuine submission. They'd assumed that men who fixed their trains had stopped thinking about escape. They were wrong, and 100 Allied soldiers proved exactly how wrong they were.